to begin, would you just state your name and then, in just a very few sentences, could you explain to this general public visitor your expertise and your interest in artificial intelligence and especially today's large language models and chatbots?
I'm Thomas Wolf. I'm a co-founder and chief scientist of Hugging Face. Hugging Face has been growing with the new AI revolution. Started before the AI revolution, the current AI revolution started, and we kind of brought to the current wave of AI a community and an open source approach, I would say.
Great. Well, I was wondering if you could also tell us a little bit about Hugging Face began as a company building a smartphone based chatbot for teenagers. If you could tell us a little bit about that story.
Yes, for sure. So the beginning of Hugging Face was actually a totally different company, I would say. We wanted to build a game, a chatbot, kind of a Tamagotchi, or maybe like a talking animal or a talking object that you would have a lot of fun interact with. The idea was to use the burgeoning new AI models to make something that would be nice, exciting experience as a game. And then while we were doing that, and while we were trying to get known and to get some visibility, some virality, we actually open source and we released a part of our research for everyone to use. And what happened and kind of surprised us was that this part, which was kind of a side project, I would say, of our early idea, became actually very viral in itself. Like people were really excited about the code we released. People were really excited about the knowledge we released on the first community project around training models that we made. And this pushed us after a few years when we were trying to raise our first large founding rounds to actually pivot the company and to say, let's put the community at the center of what we build. Let's put open source at the center of what we build. And let's see where this leads us. Well, obviously, it resonated with deep convictions, the convictions that we had, the founders, I would say. But that's something that we had not yet thought about as a company.
And could you describe a little bit more about Hugging Face developed into this leading online repository for code and models and data sets for, would you describe it as for deep learning and generative AI?
Yeah, yeah, sure. This came quite progressively, I would say. We started really with this idea of making some research code more accessible, mostly code coming out of Google at this time, which was using TensorFlow. There's a lot of like framework that were difficult for people to use and like layman beginners in the field, and also other researchers. And so the first library that I coded actually, so that was in 2018 during conference in Brussels, was the library called PyTorch Pre-trained BERT, which was this first model that Google released in 2018 called BERT. That was maybe the first generic purpose model out there, I would say. The first model in NLP, in text processing, that could do a little bit of everything. So people were quite excited about this model, but it was difficult to use. And so this first framework was out there, and then a couple of other models came out, and I was like, yeah, maybe it's nice if we can compare them together so we don't become like dependent on one single trained artifact. And so that led to this idea of gathering several models, just four at the beginning. And we were joking that maybe one day we'll have 10 models. Today we have 500,000 models on the hub, and it's growing like crazy. So we decided to start building this, and then starting after a few months to make a real website around it, which would become the burgeoning Hugging Face hub. And then that's a bit the time that I was starting to get interested in data and thinking that there was also a lot of pain points in how data sets, because they're really so important for AI. Actually, very often what you discover is that the architecture of the model is not so important, and the only thing that's really important in how good the model is at the end is the quality of the data and how you select the data. So this part was really underlooked, and all the data sets were a bit spread around. Some of them were on Google Drive, some of them were on GitHub, some of them were on the Dropbox somewhere. And so we decided to maybe also try to gather them on a place that would be easy to access. And so that led us maybe to first extension of the hub to the data sets. And then the natural extension was this idea from Julien, which was to build spaces, which are kind of demo where you can very easily interact with models, where you can very easily, play with a new model that's been released and understand what are the limitations of the model, where does it work, where does it not work, and also share with other the experience that you had interacted with it. For instance, text to image models, right? You want to share the images that you create with them. And so that led us to our third extension, Spaces, quite soon. And I would say now what we see is we have a huge community using the hub, and so we're focusing more and more on trying to make it like a nice community experience as well. Like you feel like you're actually using this model with other people. You can talk with them, you can react on models, you can open discussion pages, and this type of thing. So that's really what we've been building more and more in the past few months.
I'm going to ask a little bit of a follow up question here because it seemed like, with Google's BERT model, if correct me if I'm wrong, but this was the one that really introduced the use of transformers, this new kind of mathematical technique. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so. Transformers, the architecture was discovered a little bit before, right, in 2017. And in that time, 1 year was still quite a normal time to really get the gist of a paper. I would say the first model was probably GPT-1, slightly before BERT, but which was trained on a smaller data set. But that was the first one that kind of compared LSTM transformer and showed that actually transformer could be used for other things than just the original idea. So the original transformer paper was really this machine translation paper, focusing on translating language from one language to the other. And GPT-1 showed, yeah, you can also use that to generate like stories. And then BERT really not far after that came out and say, yeah, actually you can even do more than generating stories. You can actually also do test classification, NER, like a lot of things together. And so, yeah, definitely at this time, BERT quickly became the one reason that people stopped working on everything else, I would say, in NLP and focused on transformer. And we had this surge of research paper that were all based on this BERT model. Which thankfully was open source at the time, and that's one reason a lot of work came out of this. And that's also why when GPT-2 and GPT-3 were released and were more closed source, we also thought, hey, there is something going on here. The field is a little bit closing the doors on models, so we should maybe ramp up and push for open source. That's what led us to the third part of Hugging Face work, I would say.
And correct me. I would love to get your opinion on this, but my reading of kind of the Hugging Face story is that this work, while there's this pivot going on to this new tool, this new approach, transformers, that your Hugging Face's provision of this sort of this technology in a more easy to use, accessible, open source way became a kind of a vital tool for all of these researchers who are interested in exploring transformer models. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. You need, I think, access to knowledge, access to model, access to data set is really the thing that is essential to be able to do real research and good research, right? And so the way we provided that with a very humble approach, like we are just here to unlock all this potential was very well received. And so at first it was with a core of researchers, and then soon I would say the whole research community. But today, what is also an interesting development is that this research community is more and more made of people who are really smart but don't really follow the traditional path of getting a PhD and then becoming associate professor or like postdoc. They are like this kind of hackers, in Heliter or like posting on Reddit, and they use all our tools and they do um, things that should be considered as research. Like one good example is the field of model merging that we've been working on that a bit the past week, which is this idea that you can take two good models and you can actually mix them together to get one model that can do a little bit of what both models do. This is a field that has been pushed by a whole ecosystem of community members, and very few of them are affiliated with research lab. And so these people, they really use our tools and they jump very quickly to state of the art because these tools are very easy to use and the models that are there are state of the art as well.
Well, thank you. Well, could we maybe get into talking about Bloom, and could you talk about your motivations for starting this project to make the Bloom large language model?
Yeah, so the idea of Bloom, so Bloom was a bit of a crazy project, right? This idea came after GPT-3, right, which was the first model that was both, I would say, very interesting in its capabilities and not at all released or with any plan to release the model. And in the wave of GPT-3, were created a couple of startups which raised quite a lot of funds and which also had no plan to open source the model. There was also this idea at this time that maybe it was just not possible to train this model for anyone else just because of the sheer amount of compute needed, right? So I was not happy at all with this perspective for the field, and I thought, hey, actually, I'm not sure it's so crazy in terms of compute. That's what we've seen since it's actually a lot of people can train these models, but at that time that was a little bit counterintuitive, and so when I was discussing with some friends from a French supercomputer called Jean Zer, who had a 500 GPU, which is rather small for today, but was quite big. We actually made the math and we saw that actually that was quite small for a public supercomputer. So we could just apply for a grant of compute and then train a model like this. So that's what we wanted to do. And then I would say rather quick in this process, we thought maybe it's even better to open this process to the community. So even instead of just training ourselves the model with the compute, maybe we could invite other people to the table. And these other people were obviously other research group, but other people who were not ML engineer per se. So for instance, sociologists, people who wanted to use the model, right? You can use this text model for everything. So why not involving some of the down users or some of the team who are interested in using this model in the process of creation? And maybe ask them, hey, what would you like to see in this model? And let's train it so that you can use it for that. Another idea was also, let's focus on multilinguality because English is such a dominant voice in AI, right? Just such a dominant language. Maybe involving people from other countries or non-English speaking countries would let us, train a model that would be interesting for them or different for them. And so very quickly we reached out to a couple of people and everyone was interested, and this grew like up to 1,000 people in the workshop. So there was quickly the question also, how do we structure that? Should we make a consortium? Should we make something like very official? And we decided not to, in part to move fast and to not lose momentum, because when you start building a consortium we had, I think, 300 organizations, like not really involved, but like the 1,000 people involved were members from more than 300 organizations. So that would have been a crazy legal setup to do. And so we decided to go with a very community approach, just set up like a Slack, invite everyone, try to ask if some people would like to lead some, sub part of the workshop, some team forces, and that's a bit how it started. Yeah.
One thing I was really interested in about Bloom is some of the approaches toward the training data. It seemed that there are a lot of legal and ethical issues around these data sets for training that we see in the news with the New York Times suing OpenAI, et cetera, et cetera. It seemed like for Bloom, you took a kind of had sort of an explicit ethical framework around the data sets. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's maybe the most. Yeah, one of the parts which is still resonating a lot, right? Training a model, that's nice, but the model is also a bit dated now. Or like models have been trained every month and so. But the data set and the approach were very interesting, in particular because we started with a big reflection on data governance and how we wanted to build this data set. And we didn't want to just crawl, data on the web. We wanted to involve as much as possible people. And obviously, the place where you can involve the stakeholder, actually, the best is the data. You can ask them for data. You can also ask them to point you to good data sources. You can ask them to help you filter the data and understand the data, right? Because usually you don't speak all the languages that you would like to have in your data set. You can think about how you could keep them owner of their data. So we didn't went all the way, but there was a lot of discussion around. We could set up a non-profit. We even like started drafted, how this would look. A non-profit that would hold the data, or that would be some kind of a governance entity for all the data parts. We had this crazy idea of trying to gather the whole data set only from carefully selected sources. So not scrapping at all, but only keeping the sources that people would point to or like would either provide us. Um, in the end, we did had like 40% of the data set coming from these sources, which is quite nice because the goal was this GPT-3 size data, which is like 300 billion tokens, which actually we know today is a bit small. We should aim for like maybe 10 times this at least. but we did get several hundred billion tokens that were carefully selected, provided, either provided or either curated by team members, by members of the workshop. Um, there is still a lot of open question, I think, but I like this approach of putting the data work forward and being very, very open, very thoughtful about how you want to make your data set, right? Instead of what we see today, which is this very black box approach where you show only the model and the data is supposed to not be talked about at all. I think the fact that we talk in 2024 about copyright is interesting because that's maybe the first time we really talk about these topics seriously in AI again. I would say in mainstream, media, because obviously data is not very exciting as a topic. It's not very trendy, but it's the thing that power all these models.
Thank you. Um, Another thing that I thought was very interesting about the Bloom project was the license for the model. While it is an open source type of a license, it also has this, what do you call it, like a responsible AI license on it. Could you talk a little bit about that, the ideas behind that license?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that was a Ray license, which was this responsible AI licensing. And I would say at this time, um, there was a lot of the context there was that some of the reasons for not releasing, the first the GPT-2 and 3 were around misuse, and people would misuse the models and do bad things with them. And so I would say this is one extreme of the spectrum. The other extreme is you release the model in a fully open way. Basically, you don't care at all about what people will use the model for. And we wanted to find if there was a middle ground. I mean, that's also a bit, I would say, specific aspect of Hugging Face is we're not fully pro-open, not fully pro-closed. We think in many places there is like a little bit like the Buddhist middle ground that you should seek, like a little bit balancing both sides and say, actually, we probably the best for the field, at least, or maybe the field is now quite big, but it's probably somewhere a little bit in between. And here the idea was you cannot prevent every misuse. Even with ChatGPT, right? We see a lot of misuse, and disinformation is one, and it's pretty clear that there have been like a lot of misuse already. But you could at least, make the user aware and force the user to consider this thing and to sign a license that he will not use, or like he or she, or like basically the people using the model will not use it for a set of activities that you think should be prevented. And this means also that these licenses can actually evolve with time, which is a big question as well. And one reason we thought about setting up a non-profit to follow at least this part and maybe add later some additional misuse. And we had a discussion around dating the license actually a few months ago. But yeah, the idea is actually if you're a rather big company, you signing a term of use, like signing a license, is a meaningful act and is something that actually people take into consideration. Now, if you're a very large bad actor, well, maybe it doesn't prevent you from doing bad, but I would say you probably can just train the model yourself anyway. And so I would say in this case is, I think the answer is probably not even, taming down ChatGPT, but it's pretty clear that a lot of people now can train this technology. So the answer is more like a general coordination, or for me, it's close to what we do for cyber attacks and these type of things, which have been around for quite some time as well.
Thank you. Um, so, what does the future look like for the Bloom project and for the Bloom model?
Yeah. So the future is in part already here because there was a nice successor to Bloom, and the workshop. The name of the workshop was actually Big Science, because Bloom is the model, but Big Science produced a lot of papers, a lot of work. There was a lot of also in terms of ethical aspect, responsible. That was the first time we carefully measured the CO2 produced during one training. All these aspects were very interesting in their own aspect. Maybe one limitation of Big Science was its size. Like 1,000 people on a project is a little bit too much, and its scope. And so for the successor that we started a couple of months after, which is called Big Code, we decided to train a code completion model. And we decided to try to make this a little bit more organized, to have a full-time team also involved, and not only volunteers, and also to take the lessons from Big Science. And so, for instance, some aspect of Big Code were having a smaller scope, focusing on code model. There's still like 500 team members, so it's still quite a large project, I would say. Focusing a bit more on a legal aspect. So there is a second to rail license for Big Code, which has been designed to also make it easier to use for companies, actually, as a commercial product as well. So I think Big Code has been a very nice project. The first model was released just before the summer and kind of started the wave of code model that we've seen in the summer. So we saw then after that Code Llama and all of this. And actually all these models have been trained on the data set that was created during Big Code, which is called the stack. In Big Code as well, we decided to focus a lot on the data. It's slightly easier because code data is usually quite well referenced. You have nice licenses, MIT, Apache. So you can nicely filter code by licenses, remove PII. So there was a lot of nice work on this aspect. And for the Big Code 2, which is almost released, actually will be next week for a small model and then a larger model later, we actually collaborate with Software Heritage, which is also a well-known foundation preserving code data. So Big Code kept this idea of inviting everyone around the table, working with nonprofits, working with every organization interested in this kind of open source community aspect, and making the whole product and the whole process, I would say, open and transparent, but try to have a little bit more guidelines around making the thing, streamlining the process of the collaboration itself.
Could you talk just last question kind of in this, well, maybe second to last question in this vein. Could you talk a little bit why you chose to focus on a large model for programming languages?
Yeah, so I think this was also an area where there were only really private and closed source model at the time. Just like Bloom, there was a big need to have more openness. And then it was a question of, I would say, people and matching. Hmm. Just We had a couple of other projects that could have been successor. We talked about the Bloom, European Bloom. There would be a Bloom 2. And then what happened is there were already like several collaboration tackling this project, and our goal is never really to try to replace people, but try to complement them. So we thought maybe we were not so needed there. This collaboration, there was like two European project. They are still going on. They're going at maybe a little bit more European pace, which is slightly slower. And so Big Code was one place where nobody was really, involved and doing something. So that's why I think there is now probably the next project will again be something here like this, where we think, oh, here is some needed artifacts, some needed training, some needed open source vibe in a subfield of AI. So maybe that's our role is to start helping there.
Well, that's thank you. That leads directly into kind of my final question on this area. Could you talk about the importance of open source approaches to, the future of this field, deep learning, artificial intelligence, generative AI?
Yeah, so I think it's essential because I would say it's pretty clear we'll create some amazing tools, and I think we can create them in a way that makes sense for everyone, or a way that makes sense for just a couple of companies, which then usually make more sense in terms of money. The way I think about the future of AI is I would like AI to be this. I'm originally a physicist, right? I did a PhD in physics. And what I like about physics is it actually belongs to everyone. Everyone can read about law of physics, everyone can learn about that. And that's kind of a common knowledge of whole humanity, right? It's not like a couple of companies know about general relativity and the other just don't know about it, so they can't build satellites, something like that. And I would like AI to be the same. I'm much more excited about the future where AI is kind of this common good and knowledge that we've managed to build as a species, actually, than something that's actually was built by one of two people and just kept as a secret by them. Now the whole question is how to build that in a nice way and a safe way and a responsible way, and that's all the question we tackle every day, I would say, at Hugging Face. But yeah, definitely, that's a very nice thing about code and software, is that we manage to foster this open source spirit, which is something a bit unprecedented in other field, right? So it's something we should keep pushing in the AI world, right? We should not say, oh, actually open source is only for pre-AI code and software.
Great. Thank you. Well, if it's okay, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and ask you some of these kind of broader questions about large language models and get your insight and opinion on them. Um, and my first question is, like, there are some experts today who are saying that chatbots based on large language models are stochastic parrots that only give the appearance of understanding things. While there are other experts who say that these systems are like emergent learners that actually do understand things about the world. What's your opinion about that debate or contrast?
Yeah, it's a deep question, huh? It's a very complex question, and I would say today maybe not enough people have also access to the right models to be able to really ask deep question about that. I would say the full stochastic approach, like we this model are just regurgitating or like just spitting training data is probably something that's a bit hard to hold today. They are definitely making some nice combination of input data. They are definitely making some they're able to make very nuanced take, and also take into account many of the things we human take into account. It's also very clear that they still fail in very surprising ways, right? GPT-3, GPT-4, sometimes on very simple logic, or like reverse question. You say, okay, this is the son of this person, who is the mother of this, and they still fail in this very very rare and strange, well, not so rare actually, but very strange question or request. So I would say my take is it's a little bit. My take is that we're probably trying to project too much our human intelligence canvas and to put it too much in these boxes. And it's probably better to try to think about a form of intelligence, so something that can definitely solve problems, but which is very different from ours, right? So, for instance, in terms of world model, I definitely think that these models have an internal world model of some kind, right? But it's also very clear that the way they are trained make it very unlikely that their world model is the same that we have, right? It's a different type of world model. So I think we still actually don't really have the semantics to name the things that would explain how these models work. What is very interesting here is the work on all the work on the more mechanistic approach of this transformers model. Can we actually reverse engineer a part of it? There is very few team working on that, but maybe that's one area where we could try to start having some concepts and say, yeah, actually this is the building blocks of a large language model, world model.
So so it sounds like you're saying that it might be beneficial to kind of break the constant comparisons to human intelligence with these systems.
Oh yeah, 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 fully. I think most of the time when a debates like this, starts being a little bit blocked and everyone's stuck on their position, it's mostly because they project human semantics behind some terms like understanding, like knowledge, and it's very hard. So I think recently there was some nice work from DeepMind around role play and how these models are role playing and how we should stop considering them as entities with intents, but just like as playing role. I think this type of work where we try to de-anthropomorphize these models is very needed. That's also how we should teach them to people who have no knowledge about how they are built. I think we should be very clear about these models are not, don't have intents like human have and these type of things. And probably that should be at some point taught about in school and various courses like computers are, also a topic of education materials now.
Yeah, I often think stressing that at the end of the day, this is a mathematical function. you
It
know, it's
is. Can do crazy things, but it's still just math and regularities and patterns in the data.
um, I wanted to ask you about some of the issues connected to trust surrounding today's chatbots based on large language models. And you mentioned it just a moment ago. Their production of statements that we can recognize as falsehoods, but that the systems kind of state with conviction, or the language of certainty. Could you talk? Sometimes called hallucinations. Could you talk about that issue?
Yeah, that's a big issue. It's a big issue for I mean, technical and more like usage and deployment questions, right? The main problem I would say for deployment question is that this model can use the language or and the way of expressing themselves, which assert with a lot of certainty what they say, and this can be very convincing for people, right? In particular, if you anthropomorphize these people and you think it's actually someone else with a deep, understanding similar to your understanding of the matter they're talking, and then you discover that actually it's all full of, if you excuse the expression, um, but at the core, right, all the tech behind this, there is a very weak difference between something that's hallucinated and false and something that's actually true, because these models are just mostly trying to find the most likely completion given their training data, right? And so in this training data, there is just everything. There is all the stories of all humanity. Some of these stories are true, some of these stories are wrong. In some of these stories, AI is dangerous. In some of these stories, AI is not. In some of these stories, people say bullshit or are novels, fully invented things. And the model, I find, is very hard to make the difference that we very easily make between things that are fully invented and things that are grounded in reality. Well, though I would say today, with the difficulty that we have in making sense of what is true and false on the internet, we also maybe have the same difficulties. But this question of grounding doesn't make a lot of technical sense for a model. So that's why hallucination are very hard to prevent in a model. You really need to put the model in this role where you think that it should really use only this subset of its training data set where everything is true, and not this whole other subset where a lot of things also fall. But sometimes you also want the model to hallucinate, right? If you want the model to write a poem, if you're a writer and you say, okay, I want to write the story of someone, for writers, hallucination are a necessity. They are not a problem. And so if you want a model that can help everyone, you will also need a model that can hallucinate, actually. It's a very tricky question. And you actually need to think about, in your deployment context, is hallucination a bad thing or a good thing? And for every model, right? I was talking just before with a startup doing text to image, and they actually want the model to hallucinate some background because they want to be able to create new background behind you. So that's a case where you really need hallucination. Yeah, so most of the time, we would like the model to just understand a lot the context around our request and being able to take the good decision around hallucinating something or not.
And and I guess this relates to data sets. Could you talk about the issue of sort of these models producing bigoted or hateful language?
Yeah, it's also a complex question. Just like hallucination, you could think about filtering all bad language from your training data. But then you risk having a model which is either working out of domain. So when someone inputs suddenly some language that's bad language, the model is out of domain. And so what we know is that we don't know what the model we predict when it's out of domain. Usually we have these models, even the LLM, and the fact that we train them on so much data means that actually they don't generalize so much, right? They don't generalize so well. So usually a better way, or at least the more contemporary way to tackle that, is actually to expose the model to every type of language, also bad language, and to then later tell the model, well, actually this part of the data that you've been trained on is a part that we want to avoid. You should not respond using this part. But the model at least know about the bad thing. It's just like, it's a little bit like kids. I don't like anthropomorphic thing. It's better to tell them this is something, and then this is also something you don't want to touch, right? Drugs, this exists, than to let them discover on their own, oh, there is this thing called drug, never heard about it, let's try to use it, right? So that's a little bit the approach that we have. It's also useful because sometimes you want to use this model to actually label bad thing as bad thing, if you want like to label spam, or if you want to label bad language, or if you want to do a filter. And then your model need to be exposed to this type of materials. So I think that's maybe an approach that make more sense. That's maybe the middle ground approach as well here, which is you don't want to be actually fully clean on your model training in terms of toxicity of the data, but you want to have a little bit, at least enough for the model to be able to recognize what it is, so that later you can prevent.
Thank you. Um, how big do you think issues connected to trust, just like the two that we just talked about, how important do you see those to the future of the actual deployment and use of this kind of technology?
Now, I think they are very, very important. Um, the thing is, trust is a very polysemantic word, right? You can have trust in many aspects. I think one way to be able to safely use this model is to build this type of trust that we have with some of our tools, where we know where they work and where they don't work. So that's often the way I use trust. For instance, I can trust my GPS because I know sometimes that it will give me bad routes, but I know how to recognize them. Sometimes I see this very tiny road. I'm like, yeah, no, that's a GPS road. I won't take this one. I trust you because I know the limits of what you can do. Today, I'm not sure we really have built this level of trust with LLM where we can, start getting an intuition from this is a bad answer, or you tell me something, but I should not trust you here. That's the notion that I think we should build, because if you don't have this notion of trust, you want to deploy them either nowhere, right, or in area where they actually should not be deployed. Like, let's say, a health advice chatbot is something that's today still very dangerous to build, I think, in terms of the consequences of bad advices. Um, and so we need to build this notion, I think, of trust with this model. And that's also why I think education and explaining how this model work and trying to make very accessible explanation of what they do, what they can and cannot do, is very important. It's a bit hard because the field itself is still progressing at a very, very high pace, right? So it's hard to pose and say, okay, what's working today and what's not working and what might never work. And so we should be able to taught that.
Thank you. Um, just a couple of additional questions, if I could. I just want to ask you about the things that you are most excited about in the potential for this technology. The things you're most excited about and the things you could think it could do for us. And also, what are the biggest sort of concerns you have, if you could speak to that?
Yeah, so I think the thing most excited about are, I would say, one way to unlock the potential of humans. Um, and I could say maybe two examples that are very different. But one way is, I think, in art. So I do advise a couple of art projects where actually you can use AI as an augmented companion or pair creator in art. So, for instance, in theater, we have a theater act right now that we're creating, where one of the actors is an AI, for instance, which give a very interesting set of options that you don't have with a human. And so using these tools, to create experiences and new things that we've never been able to create as a species is very interesting. A little bit like electronic music would have been totally impossible to create before we had computers. And so this is something we've been able to create and then access some new sounds and some new maybe experience. And the same with, obviously, movies are something that we created, with technologies, and that are now a huge part of the experience we like. And I think in the future we'll have that as well with AI. We have some kind of very interactive, entertainment that will be interesting to live. So I think this is very nice, because this unlock, new way to experience life, which is nice. I'm much more interested when these new ways are actually also gathering humans together, gathering people together, making some nice form of interaction. That way, it's kind of a solitary endeavor. That's why I think theater in particular is very exciting, I think. So that's one thing. where I think it unlocks interesting possibilities. Two other would be, one is for science. So the same, I'm still this former physicist, so I would find it very interesting to have a pair researchers that could help us, maybe think about new theories that we would have not thought about. And obviously, AI could there has kind of a compounding effect in terms of discovery breakthrough. That was the original stories of DeepMind, right? As well, Demis was very interested in doing like something that would accelerate research, and I think that's where DeepMind has had maybe the widest impact out of AI, is this AlphaFold and this type of work. Um, the last aspect will be letting maybe smaller teams do big things. So because AI and already today, ChatGPT or this kind of LLM can help you automate some tasks that were quite long to do, you can, with a much smaller team, actually accomplish bigger things. So that's quite nice. In particular, if you combine with easy access to this technology, that means that if you come from, kind of a place with lower salaries, like on the earth, and you actually don't have enough to hire a large team or something like that, you could use AI to basically make you bigger than you are. This kind of exoskeleton for your mind. Okay, so this is this very smart assistant that I think we'll see more and more. And so one thing that I expect is to see some small company with just a handful of people being able to create quite big thing. So that's also very interesting, I think, in the future. Basically, everyone could be its own CEO, basically, at some point, using AI to do all the things that you don't have the time or all the knowledge to do.
And what do you see as, the concerns about the future related to this technology that we should be most attentive to?
Yeah, there is also a lot, obviously. Huh? Also, because AI is tackling many fields, so there is all this question around breaking of reality, around deepfake, around images that are now indistinguishable from reality. In the context also of elections and political turmoil everywhere. So these are deep questions. We'll see that this year in the US, I think, as unfortunately a worldwide test trial. Um, Also, other question that I may be a bit worried about, or that I'm actually quite worried about, are adoption of these technologies in places where it should not yet be adopted. So that's kind of linked to the difficulty to know where these technologies won't work. And so we see a lot of adoption of ChatGPT everywhere. Um, One question was maybe very quickly was the question around school, right? Should now that the student do every home exercise on ChatGPT, we should probably change how we evaluate or what we ask. And so very quickly we had a widespread adoption of this technology before the field in which it was adopted was ready. And we might see that in a lot of places, in companies, in business as well, using ChatGPT for things where maybe it should not be used, or where it should be used with caution. And so this wide adoption in society is coming a bit fast to my taste. I think it would be nice to think a little bit more about, is it a good idea to use AI here or not? And typically the worst idea will be at some point, making AI in charge of taking some decision that should definitely not be taken by an AI, but that should really be carefully thought with very high, negative consequences in case of bad decision. And I worry that the people putting AI at this role might not understand the limitation of the technology well enough to do this decision carefully.
Thank you. Um, I guess the two other questions, if you have time for it. One is about this discourse where you have a set of people who are talking about apocalypse and human extinction in connection with these technologies. And there are others who are talking and kind of equally forceful language about a kind of utopia around these technologies for the future. How do you react to those sort of discourses?
Yeah, it's, well, it's definitely quite polarized, I would say, today. I think with today's AI, we're definitely not yet in the existential risk realm, right? They fail still in a lot of things. They can be useful as tools, but when you try to have them autonomous, make like long strings of action, they usually are not very good, and we are still miles away. So I'm usually not super interested in the existential risk question for today's AI. I also think there are much more dangerous things. So, for instance, we don't talk a lot about success, but that's a bit what I was talking previously. But let's say you automate something and it's actually working much better with AI. And it's actually working so much better that it breaks the sort of the sort of careful balance that there was in society. A little bit like we see for high frequency trading sometimes. You see a little bit the breakdown here. There is something that's actually operating very, very fast in a general market thing which is not fully adapted for that, and so you see this micro crash right at some point. Or like we could see that as well with AI. You're automating some low work that was working fine but quite slowly, and now it's done super fast, and you actually deeply change the full balance that was in society. um, and that could lead already to some, big crashes or finance crashes, just like we had this in 2008, right? Just a fragile, like, shift in balance in society, and so that's much more what I find close to an existential risk, I would say. And then I'm definitely more of a utopian. I think if we think carefully, we can build things that are really great about this model, about this technology. I think we do have to think carefully, and sometimes we are a little bit too much attracted by dystopia, I think, than utopia. So we also may be lacking a little bit of utopia. There is so much more that have been written about bad AI in fiction than about good AI. So sometimes we're lacking, good role model for what we should build. You see that times and times Silicon Valley is excited about this device that was actually a very bad idea in this movie, but they just want to build it because it's a good example of things to build. And so thinking a lot more about what utopia or what good AI could be is, I think, a necessity today, because for the better of the worse will be going toward what we think. We have this image, and that's very often self-fulfilling prophecy, that you think, oh, this is interesting, so naturally you actually go to build that. So that's why at Hugging Face we spend a lot of time thinking about what is a healthy community around AI.
Great. Final question for you. Thinking again about our visitors coming into this exhibit, if you could tell them one thing to kind of take away about these technologies, what do you think it would be the most, something very important for them to know about large language models, chatbots, this whole area?
I would say, well, what is important, I think that the way we should see today era is that we're inventing internet again. We're building a technology that as fundamental as internet was in the 90s, like connecting everyone, and that will very likely, just like internet did, change everything in the way we interact with the world, and potentially also the way we interact with the other human around us. So that's the time we are in now, and I think it's where we need to make the good decision to build a future that we like. The internet was a great example in my mind, because there was all this spirit of openness at the beginning that led us to have this very decentralized internet that's basically belonging to everyone. And I hope we'll be able to build AI in roughly the same way that we build the internet.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for doing this with us. It's been really great to talk to you about it. And yeah, I think it's really great to get your perspective.
Thanks, David. It was a pleasure.